The information provided in this video is for general informational and educational purposes only and is not intended as, and should not be understood as, professional educational, financial, or legal advice. Every family's educational journey is unique. We strongly encourage you to consult with local school district officials, educational consultants, and other qualified professionals to address your specific circumstances. You're trying to figure out the best school for your kid. You look at the local public school, you glance at the tuition for a private school, and then you see it, the charter school. What on earth is that? Is it public? Is it private? Is it free? Do you have to be a genius to get in? The questions pile up, and suddenly, one of the most important decisions you'll ever make feels like a pop quiz you didn't study for. This confusion is a huge problem for millions of American parents, but it ends for you right now. Forget the political noise, the confusing headlines, and the neighborhood gossip. In the next few minutes, we are going to pull back the curtain and give you the ultimate no-nonsense guide to the U.S. charter school system. This isn't about telling you what to believe. This is about giving you the tools to understand, so you can make the best possible choice for your family with total confidence. So let's start with the absolute biggest question. What is a charter school? The simplest answer is this. Charter schools are publicly funded, independently operated public schools. Let's break that down because every word there matters. Publicly funded means they are tuition-free. They are paid for by your tax dollars just like the traditional public school down the street. They are required by law to be open to all students, regardless of ability, race, or income. They cannot have special entrance exams or admission requirements, with a few exceptions for specialized schools. If they get more applicants than they have spots, which happens all the time, they are required to hold a random public lottery to decide who gets in. So let's be crystal clear. They are public schools. But here's the twist. Independently operated. This is what makes them different. Think of it this way. A traditional public school is like a local branch of the DMV. It's run directly by the government, in this case the local school district. It has to follow a massive centralized rulebook that dictates everything from its hiring practices and curriculum choices to the length of its school day. A charter school, on the other hand, is more like a contractor hired by the government to do a specific job. It's still funded by the public and serves the public, but it's managed by its own independent board. This private organization, often a nonprofit, gets to operate outside of many of those district rules. This freedom is the entire point of the charter school concept. The school gets this freedom by signing a contract, which is literally called a charter. This charter is a performance agreement. It's a deal made between the school and an authorizer, usually a state board of education, a university, or even the local school district itself. This contract lays out the school's unique mission. Maybe it's a school focused on STEM, or the arts or bilingual education, or serving at-risk students. The charter spells out exactly how the school will operate, what its curriculum will be, and most importantly, the specific academic goals it promises to achieve. For example, the charter might say, by the end of year 3, 75% of our students will be proficient in math, or our high school graduation rate will be 90%. These aren't just suggestions. They are legally binding promises. And this leads to the single most important concept you need to understand, the fundamental bargain at the heart of the entire charter school movement. Autonomy for accountability. Charter schools get autonomy, the freedom to innovate and operate differently from traditional public schools. They can hire the teachers they want, design their own curriculum, set a longer school day or a longer school year, and control their own budget. This freedom is supposed to allow them to be more nimble, more creative, and more responsive to the needs of their students. But in exchange for all that freedom, they must accept a level of accountability that is far more severe than what a traditional public school faces. If a charter school fails to live up to the promises in its contract, if its students' test scores are too low, if its finances are a mess, or if it violates the law, its authorizer can revoke its charter and shut it down permanently. This is not a theoretical threat, it happens all the time. Hundreds of charter schools have been closed for underperformance. A traditional public school, by contrast, is almost never shut down, no matter how poorly it performs year after year. That is the core trade-off, more freedom but a much bigger risk of failure. Now, you might be thinking this whole idea sounds like a modern, free-market, conservative invention. But the history here is going to shock you. The idea for charter schools was first proposed in 1988, not by a politician or a billionaire, but by a man named Albert Shanker, the president of the American Federation of Teachers, one of the largest and most powerful teachers' unions in the country. He saw it as a way to empower teachers. He envisioned small, autonomous labs within existing public schools, where teachers would be free from bureaucratic red tape to experiment with new and better ways of teaching. He wanted to create an R&D sector for public education. The idea caught on. In 1991, Minnesota passed the first charter school law in the nation, and the movement began to spread, initially with broad, bipartisan support from both Democrats and Republicans. They all saw the potential of this autonomy for accountability bargain. Seemed like a win-win, a way to inject innovation and choice into the public system, while holding schools to a higher standard. So, a system where schools are free to innovate, held to a strict contract, and can be shut down if they fail. A system born from a union leader's idea to empower teachers. It sounds almost perfect on paper, doesn't it? A common-sense solution to improving education. So why then have charter schools become one of the most explosive, controversial, and politically divisive topics in America today? Why do some parents camp out overnight just to get their child into a charter school lottery, while in other communities parents and teachers protest fiercely to keep them out? The answer is that the simple, elegant idea of autonomy for accountability got very, very complicated when it met the real world of money, politics, and the incredibly difficult job of educating millions of children. The grand experiment has produced incredible successes and spectacular failures, and understanding the difference is the key to navigating this complex landscape. So let's dive into the heart of that landscape, into the very DNA of what makes a charter school. A charter school. To do that, we have to understand the central promise, the fundamental deal that underpins this entire movement. It's what I call the grand bargain, and it's deceptively simple. The deal is this. In exchange for greater autonomy, charter schools must meet higher standards of accountability, freedom for results. That's it. That's the core idea that launched a million debates. Let's break down that first part, autonomy. Freedom. This is the engine of the charter school concept. Think about your typical, traditional public school. It exists within a massive hierarchical system called a school district. That district has a school board, a superintendent, and layers of administration. They make sweeping decisions about almost everything. The curriculum that every third-grade teacher must use, the exact length of the school day, the hiring and firing procedures for every employee, the textbooks that get purchased, even the vendors who supply the cafeteria food. It's a system built for stability and uniformity, not necessarily for agility or innovation. It's like a giant, established corporation with a century of rules and procedures. Charter schools were designed to be the opposite. They were designed to be the startups of the education world. The idea was born in the late 1980s, first proposed by a Massachusetts professor named Ray Budde. He envisioned a system where groups of teachers could be given a charter, a contract, to operate their own school within a school, free from the district's bureaucracy, to try new and better ways of teaching. The idea was picked up and championed by Albert Shanker, then the powerful president of the American Federation of Teachers. He saw it as a way to empower teachers, to unleash their creativity and professionalism. This is a crucial point that often gets lost in today's political noise. The original concept was not about privatization or competition. It was about professional empowerment and creating laboratories of innovation within the public system. The goal was that the successful experiments in these new nimble schools could then be adopted by the larger, more traditional system, benefiting all students. So, who can start one of these educational startups? The answer is surprisingly broad. It could be a group of dedicated teachers who feel stifled by the district's rigid curriculum. It could be a coalition of parents who want a specific educational focus for their children, like STEM, classical arts, or dual language immersion. It could be a community organization, a university, or a well-established nonprofit like the KIPP Foundation or Achievement First. And yes, in some states it can also be a for-profit company, a fact that has become one of the most contentious aspects of the entire movement. But having an idea isn't enough. To get the keys to a school, this group of founders has to write a charter. This is not a one-page mission statement. It's an incredibly detailed, exhaustive document, often hundreds of pages long. It's a business plan, an academic blueprint, and a legal contract all rolled into one. It has to lay out everything: the school's mission and vision, the specific student population it intends to serve, the detailed curriculum it will use, from kindergarten math to high school physics, the structure of the school day and the school year, the policies for hiring, evaluating, and firing teachers, The plan for serving students with disabilities and English language learners. The entire governance structure, including the members of the school's independent board. And, critically, a comprehensive financial plan showing how they will manage public funds responsibly. They then submit this massive application not to the federal government, but to an entity called an authorizer. The authorizer is the gatekeeper. Depending on the state, this could be a local school district, a state university, a state education agency, or even a specially created independent board. The authorizer's job is to scrutinize the application. They ask the hard questions. Is this plan academically sound? Is the leadership team qualified? Is the budget realistic? Are they prepared to meet the needs of all students? It's an intense vetting process, like a venture capital firm deciding whether to fund a new company. If the authorizer approves the charter, they grant the school the legal authority to open its doors and receive public funding. And with that approval comes freedom. This is the autonomy part of the grand bargain. A charter school, once approved, operates as its own independent public school. It gets to control its own budget. It can hire the teachers it wants, without being bound by district-wide seniority rules. It can fire teachers who aren't effective. It can choose its own curriculum, whether that's Montessori, core knowledge, or a project-based learning model they develop themselves. They can lengthen the school day to provide more instruction, or make the school year longer to combat summer learning loss. They can require students to wear uniforms. They can mandate a specific school culture built on a set of values. The goal of all this freedom isn't just to be different for the sake of being different. The goal is to allow schools to specialize and to nimbly respond to the needs of their specific students. A traditional district has to be a one-size-fits-all solution for tens of thousands of children. A charter school can be a custom-tailored suit. If a community has a large population of new immigrants, a charter could be founded with a specific focus on dual language education and support for newcomers. If a city has a booming tech sector, a group of educators and industry leaders could design a high school focused on coding and engineering, with a longer school day and partnerships with local companies. This is the incredible power and promise of the charter model. It's the idea that if you free educators from bureaucratic red tape, they can create magic. They can design schools that are perfectly matched to the students they serve, creating educational environments where children who might have gotten lost in a giant comprehensive high school can suddenly thrive. It's a compelling, powerful, and deeply American idea, rooted in innovation, choice, and a belief in the power of starting something new. But this is only half of the story. It's the sunny, optimistic, and inspiring side of the grand bargain. But every bargain has two sides. This incredible freedom, this autonomy to spend public money and educate children outside the direct control of a local school district, doesn't come for free. Comes with a condition. A very sharp, very serious condition. That condition is the other half of the bargain, accountability. The promise is that if a charter school fails to deliver on the academic goals it laid out in its contract, if it fails to educate its students effectively, then it can and will be shut down. This is the ultimate accountability, the death penalty of the education world. And it's this side of the bargain, the brutal reality of performance, metrics, and closure, where the inspiring dream of innovation collides with the messy complexities of reality. It's where the debate stops being about theory and starts getting very, very real for students, parents, and entire communities. So let's get real. The heart of the charter school promise, the single idea that separates it from everything else, is the concept of a performance contract. Think of it like this. A traditional public school is like a government agency. It exists and it will continue to exist, funded year after year, almost regardless of its performance. A charter school, on the other hand, is more like a startup that has just received a round of venture capital funding. It's been given a license to operate, a charter, for a fixed period, usually 3 to 5 years. And that charter is a legally binding contract. It's a document that says, we will achieve these specific goals for these specific students using these specific methods. In exchange, you give us public funding and freedom from many of the usual regulations. And who is the you in that deal? Who are the venture capitalists of the education world? They're called authorizers. This is a term you absolutely have to understand. An authorizer is the gatekeeper. It's the entity that grants the charter in the first place, and more importantly, it's the entity that decides whether to renew it. This could be a local school district, a state university, a state-level commission, or even a nonprofit organization. Their job is to be the tough but fair overseer. They are supposed to hold the school's feet to the fire. They are the accountability engine. So what are they looking for? What's in this high-stakes report card? It boils down to 3 critical areas. First, and most obviously, academic performance. This is the headline grabber. Are students learning? How do we know? The answer, for better or worse, is often standardized test scores. We're talking state-mandated math and reading exams. But it's not always as simple as looking at raw proficiency rates. A more sophisticated authorizer will look at student growth. They'll ask, are students, especially those who started far behind, making more than a year's worth of progress in a single school year? They'll also look at graduation rates, college acceptance rates, and other indicators that the school is fulfilling its educational mission. Second, and this is the one that gets less press but is just as crucial, is financial health. A brilliant educational model is useless if the school goes bankrupt. The authorizer acts as a financial watchdog. They conduct annual audits. They scrutinize the school's budget. Is the school solvent? Is it spending public money responsibly? Are there clear firewalls between the nonprofit school and any for-profit management companies it might be working with? A school that is a financial mess is a school that is at risk of sudden collapse, which is a catastrophe for the families it serves. Financial failure is a non-negotiable deal breaker. The third pillar is organizational performance. This is the catch-all for everything else that makes a school function. Is the school's leadership board operating legally and transparently? Is the school following the law when it comes to things like special education services and civil rights? Is it adhering to the terms of its own charter? This also includes things like parent satisfaction surveys and teacher retention rates. Essentially, is this a well-run organization that is true to its mission and compliant with the law? These 3 areas, academics, finance, and operations, form a performance framework. And for several years, the school operates, collects data, and builds its case. Then comes the moment of truth, charter renewal. This isn't an automatic process. It's a formal review, almost like a trial. The school submits a mountain of evidence, test data, financial audits, board minutes, parent testimonials, to prove it has upheld its end of the bargain. The authorizer reviews everything, holds public hearings, and then casts a vote, renewal or non-renewal. And this is where the dream of innovation meets its harshest reality, closure. If a charter school consistently fails to meet its academic goals, mismanages its money, or violates the law, its authorizer is expected to shut it down. This is the ultimate tool of accountability. The tough love promise of the charter movement is that failing schools will not be allowed to linger for decades, trapping generations of students. They will be closed. On paper, this sounds logical, even necessary. Why should we keep a bad school open? But in the real world, the closure of a school is a seismic event for a community. Imagine hundreds of families suddenly being told, often with just a few months' notice, that their child's school will cease to exist. They have to scramble to find a new school. The social fabric of that community is torn apart. Friendships are broken. Trusted teachers are lost. For a child, especially a vulnerable one, this kind of disruption can be deeply traumatic and academically damaging. This triggers one of the fiercest debates in the charter world. Proponents of strong accountability argue that closure, while painful, is a moral imperative. They say that keeping a chronically underperforming school open does far more harm in the long run than the short-term disruption of closing it. It's a form of educational malpractice to let failure fester. They believe it sends a powerful message to the entire system. Mediocrity will not be tolerated. Performance is what matters. But critics push back hard. They ask, are the metrics we're using to judge these schools even fair? Is a single standardized test score really a complete picture of a school's value? What about a school that has become a safe haven in a violent neighborhood? What about a school that excels in the arts or provides incredible social-emotional support, but its test scores are just average? By closing it, are we throwing the baby out with the bathwater? They also point out that school closures disproportionately impact low-income communities of color, creating cycles of instability. They argue that instead of a simple pass/fail system of closure, we should be focusing on providing struggling schools with more support and resources to help them improve. So you have this fundamental tension. On one side, the promise of a performance-based contract where failure has real consequences. On the other, the profound human cost of institutional disruption, and the question of whether our measurements of success are broad enough to capture what truly makes a school good. This entire high-stakes drama of performance, metrics, and closure is fueled by one thing: money. And the question of where that money comes from, who controls it, and where it ultimately goes, is perhaps the most complex and explosive part of the entire charter school story. It's a trail of public dollars, private interests, and a battle for the financial soul of American education. To understand this financial battle, you have to start with one simple revolutionary idea. The money follows the child. Imagine every single school-aged child in America has a metaphorical backpack, and inside that backpack is a stack of cash. This isn't their lunch money. It's their share of public education funding, a specific dollar amount allocated by the state and local district to pay for their learning for 1 year. In the traditional system, that backpack of cash is automatically handed over to the local public school they're zoned for. It's a predictable, centralized flow of money. Charter schools fundamentally break that model. When a parent chooses to send their child to a charter school, the child doesn't just walk out the door of their old public school. They take that backpack of cash with them. That money, that per-pupil funding, is rerouted. It no longer goes to the traditional public school district. Instead, it's wired directly to the charter school that the student now attends. On the surface, this sounds perfectly logical, even fair. Why should a school get paid to educate a student who isn't there? Proponents of this model call it student-centered funding. They argue it creates a competitive marketplace. If traditional public schools want to keep their funding, they have to up their game. They have to innovate, become more responsive to parents, and offer a better product to attract and retain their customers, the students. It's the free market applied to K-12 education. But here's where the story gets incredibly messy. Let's go back to that traditional public school that just lost a student and their backpack of cash. Let's say that backpack contained $10,000. The school has lost $10,000 in revenue, but have its costs gone down by $10,000? Not even close. The school still has to pay the mortgage on the building. It still has to pay the principal's salary. The lights, the heating, the water bill, those are all fixed costs. The librarian, the school nurse, the janitorial staff, they all still need to be paid. Losing one student, or 5, or even 20, doesn't meaningfully reduce the fundamental overhead of running a school building. Think of it like a restaurant. If a table of 4 gets up and leaves, the owner doesn't suddenly get to pay less rent or a smaller electricity bill. The cost of running the kitchen and keeping the lights on remains the same. The financial burden just gets spread more thinly across the remaining customers. For public school districts, this creates a terrifying financial spiral. As more students leave for charters, revenue plummets, but the fixed costs remain stubbornly high. This forces districts to make painful cuts. First, it's art and music programs. Then it's librarians and counselors. Class sizes get bigger. Building maintenance gets deferred. The very quality of the school begins to decline, which, in a cruel twist of irony, often drives even more parents to seek out charter school alternatives, accelerating the cycle. Critics argue this isn't creating healthy competition. It's systematically defunding and dismantling the public school system, leaving it to educate an increasingly concentrated population of students with the most profound needs, like those with severe disabilities or who are new to the country, with far fewer resources to do so. This is the central conflict. But the money trail doesn't stop there. It gets even more intricate when we ask a simple question. Where does the money that flows into a charter school actually go? The answer depends entirely on the charter school structure. Most charter schools, by law, must be registered as nonprofit organizations. This means legally, the school itself cannot be run to generate a profit for shareholders. Any extra money or surplus is supposed to be reinvested back into the school's educational mission: better teacher salaries, new technology, improved facilities. This sounds great. It sounds public-spirited. But this is where a multi-billion-dollar industry has quietly emerged, operating in the shadows of that nonprofit status. We're talking about for-profit education management organizations, or EMOs. Sometimes they're called charter management organizations, or CMOs. These are private, for-profit companies that are hired by the nonprofit charter school board to run the school. And when I say run the school, I mean run the school. The EMO handles everything: hiring and firing teachers, choosing the curriculum, managing the budget, payroll, and even the school's real estate. Here's how the money flows. Public tax dollars, that backpack of cash, go from the state to the nonprofit charter school. The nonprofit charter schools board, which is often just a small group of people, then signs a sweeping management contract with a for-profit EMO. The charter school then pays a huge chunk of its public funding, often 10 to 15% of its entire budget, sometimes more, to the EMO as a management fee. Suddenly, public tax dollars intended for the classroom have been legally converted into revenue for a private, for-profit corporation. That corporation can then use that money to pay its CEO, market its services, and most importantly, deliver profits to its private investors and shareholders. It's a perfectly legal pipeline that turns public education funds into private corporate profit. And the financial engineering can go even deeper, especially when it comes to real estate. This is one of the most lucrative and least understood parts of the charter industry. Imagine a for-profit EMO. It sets up a separate sister company, a for-profit real estate company. This real estate company buys a building. Then, the nonprofit charter school that the EMO manages signs a lease to operate in that very building. So now, the nonprofit charter school is paying rent to the EMO's sister company. And who sets the rental rate? The same people who control the whole operation. This creates a closed loop. Public tax dollars flow to the nonprofit charter, which then pays inflated, above-market rate rent to the for-profit real estate company, which is owned by the same people running the for-profit EMO. It's a mechanism for extracting maximum public dollars from the system and turning them into private wealth through property holdings. In some of the most extreme cases, you have situations where a charter school fails or is shut down, but the private real estate company that a well-connected founder controls still walks away with a valuable piece of property, paid for over years by taxpayers. Now, it is critically important to state that not all charter schools operate this way. Many charters are homegrown, standalone nonprofits. They are not managed by for-profit EMOs. They are run by dedicated educators, and every single dollar they receive goes back into their mission. They are exactly what the original visionaries of the charter movement imagined. But the system, as it is currently designed in many states, allows these complex, opaque financial arrangements to flourish. It blurs the line between a public school and a private business to the point where it can be impossible to tell where one ends and the other begins. This has led to a gold rush mentality in certain sectors of the education world, attracting private equity firms and venture capitalists who see a stable, government-funded revenue stream ripe for investment. They see a nearly $2 trillion K-12 education market that has historically been closed off to for-profit enterprise. For them, charter schools and the management companies they hire are the key to unlocking it. This intricate web of nonprofits hiring for profits, of management fees and real estate deals, has turned parts of the American education landscape into a frontier of financialization. With billions of public dollars flowing through these intricate, often private, channels, a critical question emerges. Who is making sure this money is actually educating children, and not just enriching shareholders? Who is the watchdog? And what happens when there isn't one? What happens is the electronic classroom of tomorrow. EKIT. It was an online charter school empire in Ohio, founded by a charismatic, politically connected millionaire named Bill Lager. The promise was revolutionary. A high-quality, flexible education delivered straight to your home. A lifeline for students who didn't fit the traditional mold. And for a while it looked like a stunning success. EKOT became one of the largest schools of any kind in the entire country, with enrollment soaring to over 15,000 students. Hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars poured into its coffers every single year. It was the poster child for the future of education. Then, the Ohio Department of Education asked a simple question. A question that should have been asked years earlier. Can you prove your students are actually logging in and doing the work? The state was paying EKOT over $100 million a year based on its reported enrollment numbers. But were those 15,000 students actually attending school? The answer, it turned out, was a catastrophic no. Investigators discovered that the school could only verify that a tiny fraction of its students were meeting the minimum hours required for a full-time education. For years, EKOT had been paid for thousands upon thousands of ghost students, students who were enrolled on paper but were barely, if at all, participating. The state demanded the money back. All of it. $60 million for just one school year. EKOT fought back, claiming the rules were unfair. But the house of cards was collapsing. In January 2018, the school's sponsor, its supposed watchdog, finally pulled the plug. The electronic classroom of tomorrow shut down overnight. 12,000 students were suddenly left without a school. 2,000 teachers and staff were jobless. And the founder, Bill Lager? He had personally pocketed over $1 billion in management fees and property deals through his private companies that serviced the nonprofit school he created. The EKOT disaster is the most dramatic answer to the question of who is watching the money. But it reveals a fundamental weakness at the heart of the charter system: the role of the authorizer. In theory, the authorizer is the watchdog. This is the entity that grants a charter school its contract, or charter, to operate. It's their job to vet the initial application, to monitor the school's academic and financial performance every year, and most importantly, to decide whether to renew or revoke its charter. If a charter school is a ship sailing on public funds, the authorizer is supposed to be the port authority, ensuring it's seaworthy and actually going where it promised. But here's the problem. Who gets to be an authorizer varies wildly from state to state. It could be the local school district. It could be a state university, a state education board, or even a specially created nonprofit organization. And this patchwork system creates a minefield of conflicting interests. Consider this. In many states, the authorizer receives a fee for its services, typically a small percentage, say 1 to 3%, of the charter school's public funding. Now, on the surface, this makes sense. Oversight costs money, but it creates a perverse incentive. If an authorizer approves more schools, or keeps a struggling school open, it makes more money. If it shuts a school down, its own revenue takes a hit. The watchdog is suddenly being paid by the very entity it's supposed to be watching. It's not just a potential conflict of interest. It's a structural one. The fox isn't just guarding the henhouse. He's getting a cut of the egg sales. This financial incentive can lead to a race to the bottom, a phenomenon known as authorizer shopping. Imagine a group wants to open a new charter school, but their plan is weak. Their budget is shaky, their educational plan is vague. They go to a rigorous authorizer like a major university or a scrupulous school district, and they get rejected. But in a state with multiple authorizers, that's not the end of the road. They can just go shopping for a different, more lenient authorizer, one that might be less experienced, more desperate for the oversight fees, or more ideologically driven to approve any charter, no matter the quality. They shop around until they find an authorizer willing to say yes. The result is a market for mediocrity, or worse. Weak schools that should never have opened are given a charter and access to millions in public funds. And once they are open, the incentive for the lenient authorizer to shut them down is incredibly low. Closing a school is messy. It creates political blowback, angry parents, and of course it turns off the revenue spigot. It's often easier for the authorizer to just look the other way, to accept rosy financial reports at face value, and to renew the charter, hoping things will somehow improve. This isn't to say all authorizers are bad. Many are incredibly diligent. States like Massachusetts have a reputation for tough, high-quality authorizing. They approve very few charter applications, but the ones they do approve tend to perform well. They conduct rigorous, in-depth reviews and are not afraid to shut down schools that fail to meet their academic and financial promises. In these places, the system works more or less as intended. The watchdog has teeth and it bites. But in other states, the landscape is a free-for-all. For years, states like Ohio, Arizona, and Florida were criticized for having lax oversight that allowed for profit companies and unqualified operators to run schools with little accountability. It was in this environment that a school like ECOT could grow into a billion-dollar behemoth built on phantom students, all while its authorizer, a nonprofit called the Educational Service Center of Lake Erie West, cashed the checks. The problem is compounded when for-profit management companies are involved. As we touched on before, these EMOs and CMOs often sign contracts that give them near total control of the school's finances, staffing, and curriculum. These contracts can be deliberately opaque, making it incredibly difficult for an authorizer, even a diligent one, to see exactly where the money is going. How can you effectively oversee a school's finances when the bulk of its spending is a single line item payment to a private, for-profit company that has no legal obligation to open its own books? You can't. You're auditing a black box. This lack of transparency and accountability has real, human consequences. When a charter school is mismanaged, it's not just about wasted tax dollars. It's about the students. It's about the first grader who spends a year in a chaotic classroom with unqualified, rotating teachers and learns next to nothing. It's about the high schooler who graduates from a credit recovery charter mill with a diploma that hasn't prepared them for college or a career. And it's about what happened to the 12,000 students of ECOT. When the school collapsed, they were thrown into chaos mid-year. Local public schools, already underfunded partly because of the money diverted to ECOT, had to scramble to absorb them. Many of these students were already vulnerable, from low-income families or with special needs, and the sudden disruption was devastating. They were the victims of a system where the promise of choice and innovation was used as cover for a massive financial fraud, A fraud that was allowed to fester for years because the watchdog was either unwilling, unable, or unincentivized to do its job. So the system of oversight is, at best, a fragile patchwork. At its worst, it's an open invitation for grift and failure. This leaves us with the most important question of all. Forget the money, forget the politics, forget the oversight for a moment. Let's get to the bottom line. After all the debate and billions of dollars, do these schools actually work? Are they delivering on their central promise, a better education? The answer to that question is far more complicated and far more controversial than you might think. Asking if charter schools work is like asking if restaurants are good. It's a simple question with an impossibly complex answer. Which restaurant? In what city? Serving what kind of food and run by which chef? The truth is, the charter school label covers a vast and wild ecosystem of institutions, ranging from academic powerhouses that change lives to mismanaged failures that collapse overnight. There is no single answer, but by digging into the data, we can uncover some startling truths. Let's start with the success stories because they are truly remarkable. These are the schools that fuel the entire movement, the ones you see in documentaries and news headlines. Schools like KIPP, an acronym for the Knowledge is Power program, or those in the Success Academy network. These are often called no excuses charters. They typically operate in impoverished urban neighborhoods, serving almost exclusively low-income, minority students. And their results can be breathtaking. Walk into one of these schools and the difference is palpable. The school day is longer. The school year is longer. There are mandatory tutoring sessions and a relentless laser-like focus on core subjects: reading, writing, and math. Discipline is strict, expectations are sky-high, and the culture is built around a single unifying goal: college. For everyone, these schools run on the belief that demography is not destiny, and that with the right structure and teaching, any child can succeed. And on paper, they prove it. Year after year, these networks post test scores that don't just beat their local district schools. They often rival the scores of students in the wealthiest, most affluent suburbs. They send kids who were years behind grade level to top-tier universities. For proponents, this is the silver bullet. It's proof that the model works. It's evidence that when you free schools from bureaucracy and empower them to innovate, you can break the cycle of generational poverty. Critics, of course, have long argued that these schools cherry-pick the best students, leaving the most difficult-to-educate kids behind in the public system. But many of the most sought-after charter schools are so oversubscribed they have to use a random lottery for admission. This lottery system created a golden opportunity for researchers. By comparing the students who won the lottery and got in, to the students who lost the lottery and stayed in their local public school, you create a near-perfect controlled experiment. And study after study of these high-performing schools found the same thing. The kids who got in did, in fact, do significantly better. The schools were making a real measurable difference. This isn't a myth. The miracle schools are real. But, and this is a massive but, they are not the whole story. For every KIPP or Success Academy, there is a sea of other charter schools that are profoundly average, and many that are just plain bad. The promise of charter schools was that freedom and competition would naturally lead to better schools. Bad schools would lose students and close, while good schools would thrive and replicate. The reality has been much messier. All across the country, you can find charter schools that perform no better than the neighborhood public school down the street, and a significant number that perform much, much worse. These are the schools that don't make headlines. The ones run by inexperienced operators, plagued by high teacher turnover, or entangled in financial mismanagement. Stories abound of schools shutting down abruptly mid-semester, leaving hundreds of families scrambling to find a new place for their children. The very freedom that allows the best charters to innovate also allows the worst ones to fail spectacularly. The lack of oversight can be a double-edged sword. So, how do we make sense of this? We have undeniable, life-changing successes on one hand, and a landscape of mediocrity and failure on the other. What does the big picture look like? For that, we turn to the most comprehensive research ever conducted on charter schools, from a team at Stanford University's Center for Research on Education Outcomes, or CREDO. The CREDO researchers came up with a brilliant method. They essentially created a virtual twin for nearly every charter school student in the country. For each student, they found a student in a traditional public school who was an exact match on everything that matters: race, gender, socioeconomic status, English language proficiency, special education status, and even their prior test scores. Then they compared their academic growth over time. It was the closest anyone could get to a nationwide apples-to-apples comparison, When the first major Credo study was released in 2009, it sent a shockwave through the education world. It found that, on average, students in charter schools were actually learning less than their virtual twins in traditional public schools. Only 17% of charter schools produced better results in math, while 37% were significantly worse. The rest were about the same. It was a devastating blow to the movement, suggesting that for all the hype, the charter experiment as a whole was failing. But then something started to change. Credo repeated the study in 2013, and again most recently in 2023. And the picture shifted dramatically. By 2023, the trend had completely reversed. The study, now covering over 2 million charter school students, found that the average charter student was gaining the equivalent of 16 extra days of learning in reading, and a staggering 30 extra days of learning in math each year compared to their public school peers. The charter sector, it seemed, had gotten its act together. Bad schools had been weeded out, good models had been copied, and the system was learning and improving. Case closed, right? Charters work. Well, not so fast. Because when you dig just one layer deeper into that data, the most important and controversial finding emerges. The answer to do charter schools work isn't yes or no. The answer is, it depends entirely on who you are. The massive gains that Credo found were not evenly distributed. They were driven almost entirely by the progress of Black and Hispanic students, particularly those living in poverty in urban centers. For these students, the positive effect of attending a charter school was enormous. It was the equivalent of months of extra learning each year. For millions of the nation's most underserved students, charter schools are, on average, delivering on their promise in a powerful way. However, for white students and Asian students, the results were the complete opposite. The Credo studies found that, on average, these students learned less in charter schools than their counterparts in traditional public schools. The same was true for students in suburban and rural areas. For them, the charter school effect was either non-existent or slightly negative. This is the fundamental paradox of the charter school debate. The very schools that can be a transformative lifeline for a low-income Black student in Harlem can be a demonstrably worse option for a middle-class white student in a suburb of Ohio. This explains why the debate is so polarized and so dependent on geography and community. Both sides are looking at the same system, but they are seeing completely different realities. Even within the successful no excuses models, there's a fierce debate about how they achieve their results. Critics argue that the intense, restrictive environments and rigid disciplinary codes can crush creativity and burn students out. They raise serious questions about whether these schools subtly counsel out or push away students with behavioral problems or severe learning disabilities, effectively boosting their own test scores by filtering out the hardest to teach kids. The data on this is murky and hotly contested, but it points to a deeper question. Are these schools successful because their model is superior, or because they cultivate a more compliant and motivated student body? So we're left with a deeply fractured picture. We have a system that has produced some of the most effective poverty-fighting schools in the nation, lifting up underserved communities in a way that many thought was impossible. Yet, the system as a whole is a high-stakes gamble, a marketplace of incredible variability where a family might find a world-class education or a failing institution. The biggest beneficiaries are Black and Hispanic students in cities, while for many others, charters offer no academic advantage at all. This reveals that the ultimate question isn't just about test scores. It's about the kind of system we want to build. Even if we accept that the best charter schools are creating islands of excellence for some of our most vulnerable children, we have to ask a much bigger, more unsettling question. What is the effect of these schools on the 90% of students who are not in them? What happens to the traditional public school system when charter schools arrive in town? Does this competition lift all boats? Or does it end up sinking the ship that most kids still rely on? That is where the battle over charter schools gets truly personal and truly explosive. To understand the explosion, you have to follow the money and the students, because in American public education, they are one and the same. When a student leaves a traditional public school for a charter school, the public funding designated for that child, thousands of dollars in state and federal aid, leaves with them. On the surface, this seems perfectly fair. The school educating the child should get the money for the child. Simple, right? But the reality for the school district left behind is anything but simple. It's a slow-motion financial crisis. Imagine a public elementary school has 500 students. The district gets, say, $15,000 per student, for a total budget of $7.5 million. That money pays for everything: the principal, 20 teachers, the school nurse, the librarian, the janitors, the electricity to keep the lights on, the heat in the winter, the mortgage payment on the building itself, and the pension contributions for retired staff. These are what economists call fixed costs. They don't change much whether you have 500 students or 450. Now a new charter school opens down the street. It's shiny, it has a specialized curriculum, and it's aggressively marketing to local families. Over the summer, 50 students from that elementary school unenroll and sign up for the charter. That means 50 students times $15,000 each equals $750,000 that vanishes from the public school's budget. A 10% cut. But can the principal fire 10% of the librarian? Can they shut off 10% of the lights? Can they stop heating the west wing of the building? Of course not. The mortgage payment is the same. The building is the same size. You still need a nurse, a principal, and a full-time janitor. So what gives? The school has to make cuts. Maybe they lay off 2 of the newest teachers, increasing class sizes for everyone else. Maybe the art and music programs, those so-called extras, are the first to go. The after-school tutoring program gets axed. The library's budget for new books is frozen. The school starts to feel diminished, less vibrant. And as the public school's offerings shrink, it becomes less attractive to the remaining parents, which can cause even more families to look for alternatives, like that charter school down the street. This creates a downward spiral, what critics call a financial death spiral, where the public school is slowly starved of the resources it needs to serve the students who remain. From this perspective, charter schools aren't just competing. They're actively cannibalizing the traditional system, leaving it weaker and less capable of serving its community. But the financial drain is only one part of this explosive debate. The other, even more controversial accusation, is about which students are leaving. Critics have long argued that many charter schools engage in a practice known as cream skimming or cherry picking. The charge is that they are subtly, and sometimes not so subtly, filtering for the easiest to teach and least expensive students. This doesn't necessarily mean they have a sign on the door that says, "Only a students apply." The filtering can be more insidious. A charter might have a lengthy, complicated online application that requires reliable internet access and a parent who is savvy enough to navigate it. It might not provide bus transportation, effectively excluding families who can't provide their own rides every morning and afternoon. Some charters have strict no-excuses disciplinary policies that push out students with behavioral challenges, sending them back to the local public school. And then there's the issue of special education. Federal law requires all public schools, including charters, to serve students with disabilities. But studies have shown that, on average, charter schools enroll a lower percentage of students with severe, and therefore more costly disabilities compared to their neighboring district schools. The result of this alleged sorting is profound. The traditional public school doesn't just lose students. It can lose the students whose families are the most engaged, and who are the least costly to educate. What's left behind is a higher concentration of students in poverty, English language learners, and students with significant special needs. The public school's job gets harder, its student population becomes more challenging, all while its budget is shrinking. It's a recipe for failure. Now, advocates for charter schools hear these arguments and they have a powerful one-word response: competition. They argue that for over a century, the traditional public school system has operated as a government-run monopoly, with no incentive to improve. If you were unhappy with your assigned neighborhood school, your only option was to move or pay for private school. Charter schools, they say, finally inject a dose of healthy, all-American competition into that stagnant system. If a public school is losing students to a charter, that's not a tragedy, it's a market signal. It's feedback. It's telling the school district, you are not meeting the needs of these families. Do better. From this viewpoint, the financial pressure isn't a death spiral. It's a wake-up call. It forces school districts to become more efficient, to get rid of bureaucratic bloat, and to be more responsive to parents. Proponents will point to districts where the arrival of charters spurred the public schools to create their own innovative programs, like magnet schools or language immersion academies, in an effort to win families back. They argue that this competition ultimately lifts all boats, forcing every school in the area, charter and traditional alike, to up its game. They contend that trapping kids in a failing school, just to protect the system's finances, is morally wrong. The focus, they insist, should be on the child, not the institution. If a charter school offers a child a better shot at success, that child should have the right to take it, and the funding should follow them. To deny them that opportunity is to prioritize the comfort of the bureaucracy over the future of a child. So who is right? Does competition create a rising tide? Or does it sink the fleet of traditional public schools? The research, frustratingly, is all over the map. There are credible studies that show significant negative financial impacts on districts with high charter enrollment. There are other credible studies, like a landmark analysis from Stanford Center for Research on Education Outcomes, or CREDO, that have found that attending some urban charter schools can provide students with the equivalent of months of additional learning per year. And then there are still other studies showing that traditional public schools do modestly improve their own test scores when a charter school opens nearby. The competitive effect appears to be real, even if it's not always dramatic. The answer seems to depend entirely on where you look and what you choose to measure. In a city like New Orleans, where after Hurricane Katrina the traditional district was almost entirely replaced by charter schools, you can find stories of incredible academic turnarounds and heartbreaking school closures, sometimes on the same city block. The battle over impact isn't just an academic debate. It's a fight over the fundamental purpose of public education. Is the goal to create a marketplace of individual school choices, where parents act as consumers and schools compete for their business? Or is the goal to support a unified, universal system of neighborhood schools that serve as community anchors, educating every single child who walks through their doors, no matter their background or ability? The rise of charter schools has forced America to confront this question head-on, and it raises a terrifying possibility that in the name of choice and innovation, we may be inadvertently creating a two-tiered system. One for the families with the resources and know how to navigate the market, and one for everyone else. This leads us to the ultimate question of oversight. When a traditional public school is failing, there's a clear chain of command. A school board, a superintendent, the state. But when one of these privately run, publicly funded charter schools fails to educate its students or mismanages its money, who holds them accountable? Who has the power to shut them down? And what happens to the children who are left scrambling when the doors are suddenly locked for good? The answer lies with a group you've probably never heard of, the authorizer. Think of an authorizer as the gatekeeper and the landlord of the charter school world. They are the ones who grant the initial charter, the legal document, the contract that allows a school to open its doors. And they are the ones with the power to take it away. This entity could be a local school district, a state university, a special independent board, or even a nonprofit organization. The specific type of authorizer varies wildly from state to state, and this single detail is one of the most critical and controversial aspects of the entire charter system. Because the charter isn't just a permission slip, it's a performance contract. Spelled out in that document are the specific academic goals the school promises to meet. Maybe it's a certain percentage of students reaching proficiency in math and reading. Maybe it's a target graduation rate. The contract also lays out the rules for financial transparency and operational stability. For a set period, usually 3 to 5 years, the school operates under this contract. At the end of the term, the authorizer's job is to review the evidence. Did the school meet its academic goals? Is its budget in order? Is it serving the community it promised to serve? Based on the answers, the authorizer makes a high-stakes decision. Renew the charter, put the school on probation, or deliver the death sentence, revocation. In theory, this is accountability in its purest form. It's the free market promise applied to public education. A traditional public school, no matter how poorly it performs, almost never gets shut down. It might get restructured, its staff might change, but the institution itself persists for generations. Charter school advocates argue this is a fundamental flaw. They say their model introduces real consequences. If you don't perform, you're out. The contract is broken, the business closes, and the resources can be redirected to a school that actually works. This is the system's core feature, not a bug. It's designed to be a self-correcting ecosystem where only the fittest, the most effective schools survive. But the reality on the ground is far, far messier. The strength of this accountability chain is only as strong as its weakest link, the authorizer. And the quality of authorizers is dangerously inconsistent across the country. Some are incredibly rigorous. They have robust application processes, conduct deep and frequent oversight, and hold their schools to incredibly high standards. They see themselves as stewards of public trust and public money. They will shut down a struggling school without hesitation if it fails to meet the terms of its contract. But then there are the others, the weak authorizers. In some states, a system of authorizer shopping has emerged. A group wanting to start a charter school might get rejected by a stringent local school district. But instead of improving their plan, they can simply apply to a different, more lenient authorizer in the state, perhaps a small, under-resourced university or a state-level commission known for its rubber stamp approvals. These weaker authorizers may lack the staff, the expertise, or the political will to conduct proper oversight. They might grant a charter based on a flashy but flimsy application, and then fail to monitor the school's performance until it's far too late. This creates a race to the bottom, where the schools most in need of oversight are the least likely to receive it. It's in these weakly regulated environments that the horror stories you hear about often emerge. Stories of financial fraud, where taxpayer money is funneled to a CEO's private management company. Stories of abysmal academic results, hidden behind misleading marketing. Stories of schools that were never viable in the first place, but were approved by an authorizer more interested in the quantity of charter schools than their quality. And this brings us to the most devastating question of all: what happens to the children when the doors are locked for good? When an authorizer finally decides to shut a school down, the outcome can be chaotic and heartbreaking. Sometimes the closure is announced months in advance, giving parents time to navigate the complex process of finding a new school. But often it happens abruptly. A letter goes home one day, or an email lands in an inbox, announcing the school will be closing in a matter of weeks, or even days. Sometimes the school closes mid-year. Imagine being a parent in that situation. The school you chose, the community your child was a part of, has just evaporated. Suddenly, you are thrown back into the school selection scramble. But this time it's an emergency. You're calling the local district, trying to find a seat in a neighborhood school that is likely already full, and may not have been your first choice for a reason. You're trying to arrange new transportation. Your child is losing their friends, their teachers, their routine. They are, in effect, educational refugees displaced by a failed experiment. The data on these displaced students is sobering. Studies have shown that the academic shock of a mid-year school closure can set a child back significantly. They arrive at their new school behind their peers, struggling to adapt to a new curriculum and a new culture. The promise of charter school accountability, that closing a bad school is a net positive for the system, rings hollow for the individual child who pays the price for that closure. Their education is disrupted, their social networks are shattered, and their faith in the system is broken. Proponents will argue again that this is a necessary, if painful, part of the process. They contend that it's better to endure the short-term pain of closing a failing school than to allow thousands of children to languish in it for years. They believe that ultimately, this process strengthens the overall educational landscape, weeding out ineffective options and making room for better ones. It's a classic utilitarian argument. The suffering of a few is justified for the greater good of the many. But that calculation feels very different when it's your child holding a letter, wondering where they're going to go to school on Monday. The closure of a single charter school can impact hundreds, sometimes thousands of students at once. When a large charter network collapses, as some have, it can send a shockwave through an entire city's education system, overwhelming neighboring schools and leaving a trail of displaced families. So while the mechanism for accountability exists on paper, its application in the real world is fraught with peril. It hinges on the diligence of often overburdened authorizers, and it treats the displacement of children as a feature of reform, rather than a catastrophic system failure. This tension between market-based accountability and community stability is a central conflict in the charter school debate. But there's another layer to this story of accountability, one that moves beyond simple closure and into the very DNA of how these schools are run. Because what happens when a charter school isn't just a school, but a business? What happens when the drive for educational innovation becomes entangled with the drive for profit? This is where the line between public service and private enterprise begins to blur, creating a whole new set of questions about who these schools are truly serving: the students or the shareholders? And that question of who is being served is the absolute crux of the debate over for-profit charter schools. To be clear, the vast majority of charter schools themselves are legally registered as nonprofits. The controversy arises from a rapidly growing model where the nonprofit board of a charter school hires a for-profit company to manage nearly every aspect of the school's operation. These are called Education Management Organizations, or EMOs. Think of it this way: the school is the storefront, a nonprofit entity with a public-facing mission. But behind the scenes, a for-profit corporation is running the show, pulling the levers, and most importantly, collecting the profits. How does this actually work? Let's trace the money. A charter school receives public funding from the state for each student it enrolls, just like a traditional public school. This is taxpayer money. The nonprofit board of the charter school then takes a significant portion of that public funding, sometimes as much as 95%, and hands it over to the for-profit EMO in exchange for its management services. Suddenly, millions of public tax dollars designated for education are flowing directly into the accounts of a private, for-profit corporation. The EMO then uses that money to pay for everything: teacher salaries, textbooks, electricity, and janitorial services. Whatever is left over after all those expenses are paid is pure profit for the company and its investors. This model immediately creates a powerful incentive that doesn't exist in traditional public education: the incentive to reduce costs. In a public school, if a principal finds a way to save money, that money typically stays within the school or the district to be reinvested in new programs, more supplies, or better facilities. But in a school run by a for-profit EMO, every dollar saved on a child's education is another dollar that can be booked as profit for shareholders. This fundamental conflict is at the heart of the most serious criticisms against the for-profit model. Critics point to a number of common strategies used to maximize these profits. One is staffing. For-profit EMOs have been found to hire younger, less experienced teachers who command lower salaries. They might also have higher student-to-teacher ratios, meaning more crowded classrooms. They may also cut back on support staff that are crucial but not always legally mandated in the same way, like school librarians, counselors, or nurses. Every position that goes unfilled, every experienced teacher replaced by a rookie, contributes to the bottom line. Another major area is special education. Providing services for students with disabilities can be expensive, requiring specialized staff, equipment, and lower class sizes. Numerous studies and investigative reports have found that some for-profit charter chains enroll a disproportionately low number of students with severe disabilities. They are accused of cream skimming or cherry-picking students who are less expensive to educate, leaving the more challenging and costly students to the traditional public school system, which by law must accept everyone. While they may not explicitly deny a student with special needs, the process can be made difficult, or the school might claim it simply doesn't have the resources to provide the required support, encouraging parents to look elsewhere. But perhaps the most opaque and controversial method for extracting profit involves real estate. This is a brilliant business strategy, but one that raises profound ethical questions. Often, a for-profit EMO will create a separate sister company, a real estate holding company. That real estate company will buy or build the school facility. Then it will lease that building back to the charter school, the one its parent EMO is managing, at a very high, often above market rate. Remember, the lease is being paid for with public tax dollars. So, taxpayer money is being used to pay inflated rent to a private company, which then uses that money to pay the mortgage on the building. In effect, the public is buying a building for a private company. Once the mortgage is paid off, the real estate company owns a valuable asset, free and clear, that was entirely paid for by the public. Meanwhile, the school is locked into an expensive lease, siphoning money that could have been spent on teachers, books, or technology. Proponents of the for-profit model argue that this is a gross mischaracterization. They contend that the profit motive is the single greatest driver of innovation and efficiency in the American economy. So why should education be any different? They argue that traditional public school districts are bloated, inefficient bureaucracies, trapped in union contracts and outdated practices that waste billions of taxpayer dollars every year. A for-profit company, they claim, has every incentive to cut that waste and run a lean, efficient operation. They can innovate with new teaching methods, new technologies, and new school models without being bogged down by red tape. The argument is that competition is inherently good. If a for-profit charter school can provide a better education for the same or less money than the local public school, shouldn't that be celebrated? The profit, in their view, is simply a reward for that efficiency and success. It's the engine that drives them to perform better. They might say that focusing on real estate deals is a red herring. Schools need buildings, and someone has to own them and lease them. Using a private company, they argue, can be faster and more flexible than waiting for a slow-moving public district to pass a bond measure and build a new school. Furthermore, they push back on the idea that they skimp on quality. Their survival, they say, depends on results. If their students don't perform well on standardized tests, and if parents aren't happy, those parents will pull their children out. The school will lose its enrollment, its funding, and eventually its charter. The market itself, they believe, is the ultimate form of accountability. A bad school, whether it's for profit or public, will eventually fail. A good school will thrive, and if it happens to be run by a for-profit company, that company deserves to be rewarded for its success. This brings us to a deep philosophical schism in how we view education. Is a school a business, and are parents and students its customers? If so, then the principles of market competition, efficiency, and profit make a certain kind of sense. The goal is to provide a competitive product, a good education, that customers will choose. The best providers will succeed and grow, while the worst will fail and disappear, strengthening the overall marketplace. Or is a school a public trust, a fundamental right, and a common good? In this view, education is not a product to be bought and sold. It's a foundational service that society owes to every single child, regardless of their abilities, their background, or how cost-effective they are to educate. In this model, the introduction of a profit motive is seen as a corrupting influence, one that forces schools to make decisions based not on what is best for the child, but on what is best for the balance sheet. It creates a system of winners and losers, where schools might be incentivized to avoid the most vulnerable students, the very ones who need the most help. So we have this clash of ideologies: the market-driven efficiency of the private sector versus the public service mission of traditional education. But this entire debate raises an even bigger, more fundamental question. What is the ultimate goal of education in America? Is it to create a competitive marketplace of schools? Or is it to ensure a high-quality, equitable education for every single child, regardless of their zip code? The answer to that question will define the future of not just charter schools, but our entire public education system. That question, whether the goal is a marketplace or a public trust, is the ideological battlefield where the future of American education is being fought, and the outcome is anything but certain, because as we look ahead, the charter school movement is entering a new, more complicated phase. The era of explosive, unchecked growth is likely over. What's replacing it is a series of intense, localized struggles over what these schools should be, who they should serve, and who holds them accountable. One of the biggest battlegrounds is the issue of authorization. Remember, authorizers are the gatekeepers. They decide which charters get to open and which ones get shut down. For years, many states encouraged a wide variety of authorizers, universities, independent state boards, nonprofits, to spur competition and growth. But now the pendulum is swinging back. We're seeing a major push in some states, like California, to give local school districts more power to reject new charter applications, especially if they can prove the new school would harm the district's financial stability. Proponents say this is a necessary check and balance, preventing charters from draining resources from traditional schools that serve the majority of students. They argue it's about community control and responsible planning. But charter advocates fire back that this is just protectionism. They claim it's a tactic by established bureaucracies and teachers' unions to kill competition and trap kids in failing schools, using financial excuses to deny parents a choice. This fight over who gets to say yes or no is fundamentally a fight for control over the future of public education in a community. And right alongside it is the ever-present war over funding. The simple phrase "money follows the child" sounds fair, but the reality is a mathematical hornet's nest. When a student leaves a traditional public school for a charter, a certain amount of per-pupil funding goes with them. But the traditional school's costs aren't so easily reduced. They still have to heat the building, run the buses, and pay the librarian even with a few fewer students in each classroom. District leaders call this a death spiral, where declining enrollment leads to budget cuts, which leads to program cuts, which makes the school less attractive, causing more students to leave. It creates a cycle of disinvestment. Charter supporters argue this is exactly the point. It forces inefficient, bloated districts to become more responsive and fiscally responsible. They contend that the money belongs to the child's education, not to the system or the building. The next frontier in this battle is facilities funding. Most charters have to pay for their buildings out of their operating budgets, while traditional public schools are often funded through separate local bonds. This creates a massive inequity, and we are now seeing huge political pushes for state laws that would force districts to share their bond money, or even provide empty district buildings to charter schools. It's a bitter, high-stakes conflict over finite resources. But perhaps the most profound change happening from within the charter movement itself is the rise of unionization. For decades, a core part of the charter brand was freedom from union contracts. This flexibility, they argued, allowed them to innovate, to have longer school days, hire non-traditional teachers, and fire those who were ineffective. For many teachers, however, this flexibility meant something else. Longer hours for less pay, a lack of job security, and no collective voice in their working conditions. As a result, teacher burnout and high turnover rates have plagued many charter schools. Now, we are witnessing a wave of charter school teachers across the country organizing and joining unions. They are demanding better pay, more sustainable work hours, and a say in school policy. This is a seismic shift. It challenges the foundational argument that charters need to be free from collective bargaining to be successful. It also blurs the lines between charter and traditional public schools. As charter teachers unionize, their schools start to look a little more like the systems they were designed to replace. This movement could fundamentally reshape the charter labor model, forcing a national conversation about whether innovation and teacher protections are mutually exclusive. And you can't talk about the future without addressing the elephant in the room: for-profit management. While charter schools themselves must be nonprofits, many are run by for-profit education management organizations, or EMOs. These companies handle everything from curriculum and staffing to finances and operations, taking a management fee, often 10 to 15% of the school's public funding, right off the top. Supporters argue these EMOs bring private sector efficiency, economies of scale, and expertise to the table, allowing educators to focus on educating. But critics see a glaring conflict of interest. They point to cases where EMOs have engaged in questionable real estate deals with their own schools, charged exorbitant management fees, or cut corners on student services to maximize their return. The very idea of generating profit from public education dollars meant for children makes many people deeply uncomfortable. The future debate here will be about transparency. There is a growing demand for laws that would subject these for-profit EMOs to the same public records and open meetings laws as traditional school districts, forcing them to open their books and show exactly where every taxpayer dollar is going. What all of this means is that the simple, clean narrative of charters good, traditional schools bad, or vice versa, is collapsing. The lines are blurring. We see traditional school districts adopting charter-like innovations, creating their own specialized magnet programs in schools of choice to compete. At the same time, we see established charter networks becoming their own form of bureaucracy, sometimes growing just as rigid and standardized as the districts they once criticized. The rebel is becoming the establishment. So, where does this leave you, the parent, the student, the citizen, trying to make sense of it all? It leaves you in a position of power, but also one of responsibility. The expansion of school choice means the burden of choosing now falls on your shoulders. It's no longer enough to just enroll in your neighborhood school. You have to become a savvy, informed consumer of education. And that means asking tough questions of any school you consider, charter or traditional. Don't just look at the test scores on a website. Ask, what is the teacher turnover rate? A school that can't keep its teachers is a major red flag. Ask, who sits on the school's governing board and how are they chosen? Are they parents and community members, or are they appointed by a distant corporation? Ask, can I see a detailed budget? Where does the money actually go? How much is spent on classroom instruction versus administration or management fees? And critically ask, how does this school serve all students? What are their support systems for English language learners, students with disabilities, or kids who have fallen behind? A great school has a great answer for that question. Ultimately, the 30-year experiment of charter schools has not given us a simple verdict. It hasn't proven to be the silver bullet that reformers promised, nor the destructive force that detractors feared. Instead, it has acted as a powerful disruptive force, injecting competition, innovation, and a fierce sense of urgency into American education. It has forced a long overdue, and often uncomfortable national conversation about what we want from our public schools. The future won't be decided by a single policy or a sweeping federal mandate. It will be decided in thousands of communities like yours. It will be shaped by parents demanding more transparency, by teachers demanding a sustainable profession, and by citizens demanding that every school, regardless of its label, be held to the highest standards of accountability and equity. The goal, after all, was never just to create more schools. The goal was, and must always be, to create better ones for every single child. And that is a mission that belongs to all of us.